Excellent. All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today we'll be talking about the Swedish Reformation during the reign of Gustav Vasa. So about me, I have a double major in computer science and Scandinavian studies. I'm involved with the Gustavus Newman Center, also known as Catholic Gusties. And right now I'm writing a research paper comparing and contrasting the Danish and Swedish Reformations. So I have an interest in history and religion, so I thought this topic where they intersect would be quite interesting to dive into. So to start off, a little background. So Scandinavia at the beginning of the 16th century is unified in the Kalmar Union. So it is political union of the three crowns of Scandinavia. So that being Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. It can be a little troublesome at times. Sweden is a bit of a problem child in this union, always causing trouble, being unruly, and it doesn't help that there's a bit of Danish supremacy in this. So power is really right here in Copenhagen, in the hands of the monarch. So other parts of the union are not always happy with this. So another important thing to mention is that it is homogeneously Catholic at this point. If you'll notice 1515, that's 2 years before Martin Luther with his 95 Theses. And then another thing to mention that Gustav Trolle is the Archbishop of Uppsala. So that's right here in Sweden. And he is pro-Union and pro-Denmark. So not the most popular guy in Sweden at the moment. So then more background. 1517, war breaks out between Denmark and Sweden. Denmark wins the first war, but it's pretty bloody. And then right when that war ends, another war breaks out. And then Sweden wins. Gustav Trolle flees, and Sweden finally becomes independent. So this is the guy that led that second war, where Sweden was victorious. So he's from an important noble family and well known for his military prowess. And he was crowned King of Sweden in 1523 as King Gustav I. So throughout Europe, they're not big fans of this guy. He's viewed as a usurper, and no one really wants to touch him with a 5-foot stick. He's bad news. So Sweden's independent, but no money and no friends. So not a great position. Some important things to mention is that the bishoprics of Sweden are mostly empty. I mean, these years of war were pretty bad. A few bishops were decapitated. So these positions need to be filled. And so if you don't know what a bishopric is, that's kind of an administrative unit of the church. So there are quite a few in Sweden. And Gustav Vasa thinks, well, I'm kind of in a bad spot right now. It'd be great if I could just fill these spots with my friends, and then they can support me. So he goes to the Pope, Pope being the guy who's in charge of these things. Can you make my friends bishops? No, not so happy. And then the Pope adds the further condition, you got to return Gustav Trolle to office. So remember, this guy's pro-Denmark. Gustav Vasa is not too happy with this condition. So he's in a tricky situation. What does he do? Lutheranism. So Lutheranism is not so popular in Sweden at this point, but cities like Stockholm, where there's a large foreign German merchant population, they love this stuff. So it's still coming into the country, and these two gentlemen mentioned at the bottom are going to be really important in spreading the faith throughout Sweden. So Laurentius and Olaus, pretty popular speakers, both trained theologians. Gustav Vasa sees Lutheranism and he thinks, well, this sounds like a pretty good idea. I can get some more control of the church. I can solve my problems. So he starts to support it a bit. He appoints Laurentius to be his chancellor of Sweden, and he appoints Olaus to be the preacher of Stockholm, which is, these are important roles. So definitely showing public signs of support. And then just another fun fact to mention is the New Testament is translated into Swedish for the first time. So very important for the development of Swedish. And then going further, a lot of people tend to think in the Reformation that Catholics were just sitting around twiddling their thumbs for a while, but they did actually know how to work printing presses, just so you know. So Bishop Brask of Linköping will head the response. He's pretty much the highest ranking Catholic in the country at the moment. So he's right here. He's organizing Catholic printing presses to print response materials responding to the points of the Reformation, things like what were mentioned in the 95 Theses. So this is him interacting with Gustav Vasa. He's saying, well, what are you going to do about these Lutherans? They're causing trouble. And then Gustav Vasa says, well, there'll be equal competition between you two. That seems fair to me. So Bishop Brask says, well, I'll roll up my sleeves, get back to my printing press. Gustav Vasa says, no, I'm actually gonna have to shut your printing press down, bro. So he will then flee the country, Bishop Brask. So he's kind of the last standing Catholic in the country. So not much standing in the way of the spread of Lutheranism now, speaking from these high-ranking officials. So 1527, Diet of Västerås. And if you don't know what a diet is, it's kind of like a big gathering of like clergymen, nobles will be there, king will be there. So at this diet, it's traditionally thought of as the beginning of Lutheran Sweden, even though there aren't really any big doctrinal changes that are actually happening. It's mostly just taking the political and economic power away from the church and subordinating the church to the crown. So all the lands and castles are going to be confiscated from the church, handed right over to the crown. He'll give some to nobles to get their support, but this is a very important moment because the church is made dependent upon the crown. So 2 years later, the Synod of Örebro, Catholic practices are discouraged at this synod. That's important to notice, not banned, because Gustav Vasa was, he was a cautious political player. He knew these practices were quite popular with the Swedish population, so he doesn't want to ban them because he doesn't want any more trouble, But sermon supervision by crown. So, if a priest or a preacher is going to go give a talk, the crown's going to have to take a look at that before you give it. We don't need anyone causing any trouble. So I have a few lists of revolts against Gustav Vasa. He was not the most popular man in society, especially his changes with the Reformation, but also he was viewed as a tyrant by a lot of society. So people were pretty quick to grab their pitchforks and torches. So I just want to zoom in on one of these, which is the Dhaka War. So this is kind of interesting because it's not nobles or clergymen leading the charge. It was actually peasants. So Niels Dhaka, this gentleman right here, is kind of viewed as a Robin Hood of sorts in Sweden. So he's also somewhat of a military genius. He actually defeated Gustav Vasa's father-in-law in battle, which was quite embarrassing for the king. So kind of expanded quite out through all of Småland, which is in the very south of Sweden at this point. And the reasons for this war include Gustav Vasa. Remember, he has no money, so he goes to churches, which tend to have a lot of fine things like chalices and beautiful art, and he takes that to pay the bills of Sweden. And the peasants and local clergy are not too happy about this. But then also, these peasants in the very south of Sweden just like to jump the border to trade through Danish ports because it's cheaper than going through the official Swedish ports. So untaxed trade makes the crown very unhappy. So Gustav Vasa and the Reformation, he's really a micromanager of sorts. He doesn't want anything to get by that he's not taking a look at. He's had you saw all the revolts. He knows when trouble's coming. So he refused to publish an official church ordinance, really because if you stand behind something, people can blame you for it. And he doesn't want to make any changes that could result in another revolt. So he's not actually going to push many doctrinal changes recommended by the theologians in Wittenberg. And he's really seen as uninterested in changes of doctrine. He'll actually appoint a guy to make a church ordinance, but seeing close to the end of the Dhaka War how unpopular it is, he'll actually just get rid of that guy, just put the brakes on it for a while. So beyond 1560, Gustav Vasa dies. So Reformation is unfinished until the end of the century. So we can see this in his 3 sons who become king, and this should be the first sign, because usually only 1 son becomes king. If there are 3, that's, who knows what's going to happen. So one favored Calvinism, which is another offspring of the Protestant Reformation. One favored a return to Catholicism, who was John. The first one was Eric, who was the one that favored Calvinism. Then John came to the throne. Polish wife favored Catholicism. And then Karl is the one who will finally entrench Lutheranism as the religion of Sweden. A lot of chaos in this time after Gustav Vasa, because he just left things unfinished. So this kind of, these unanswered questions just lead to chaos. Not really within the scope of the presentation, but trust me, it gets pretty crazy. So results and what happened. This is really a really obvious princely Reformation. Changes come from the top, then goes throughout society. This is also the beginning of the current day Church of Sweden. No longer the state church, but it was until 2000, which is Lutheran. Doctrinal changes will come at the end of the century with this church ordinance in 1593. But what's interesting about this is it reflects a lot more of pre-Reformation church law in Sweden. So not as many of the radical changes as we can see in, say, in the church in Denmark, where the king was a lot more zealous in his faith. But it's really interesting because in the next century, in the 30 Years' War, Sweden is this big defender of Protestantism, and it all starts from this point of the Swedish Reformation. In fact, some people will even say, if it weren't for Sweden in the 30 Years' War, European Protestantism would have gone extinct. So it's really interesting to see how we jump from the first event to the next. So, questions?
Where did you find all these great images?
I Googled, yeah.
What's the 500?
Oh, I think this is like a play on the life of Gustav Vasa. So I think this is like the 500th year of his coronation. I think this is from.
Yeah. Sure.
Come on, there must be some.
So your project's going to be comparing the Danish Reformation and the Swedish Reformation.
Yeah.
I think the way I've understood it is that people tend to think of Gustav Vasa's Reformation as very cynical. He was using Lutheranism for his political advantages, and he was the great leader against the tyranny of the Danes and became a tremendous tyrant himself when he put down one uprising after another. Meanwhile, I think the interpretation of the Danish Reformation, it was much more sincere on the part of the monarchs in Denmark were genuinely Lutheran, and they welcomed in the Reformation into their hearts, not just into their political calculations. And I'm wondering if that's sort of what you've come across in your work so far.
Yeah. So talking about the Swedish and Danish Reformations, they're both what we would call a princely Reformation, in that the change would not have happened if it weren't for the king. He's the one who's implementing everything. We do have a lot of signs that the Reformation was a lot more popular in Denmark. A lot more, you'll see like preachers go out to popular crowds, and we're seeing all this like say crowds like break down church doors, like let in our Reformed preachers. This is just not something we're seeing in Sweden to a comparable extent. So that, yeah, we have that popularity in Denmark, but then also the Danish king, Christian III. We have the historical record pretty much shows that he is a very convinced Lutheran. He did have a lot to gain politically and economically later, but his early career is really stunted by his Lutheran views. In fact, they didn't even want to make him king. He had to fight a pretty bloody civil war to even get the throne because of his beliefs. So that's why, yeah, we really do, historians tend to say that And then on to Gustav Vasa. I mean, we pretty much, going through the record, these early, like the Diet of Westeros, there's just no doctrinal changes. It's all political and economic. And we're really not seeing much in the way of changing the actual doctrine until way later. And I should mention that Christian III, once he marches into Copenhagen at the end of the war, he arrests the bishops right away, and the next day he's already, making new laws and changes to the doctrine. He already invites theologians from Wittenberg to assist in creating a new church ordinance. So I would say what you have previously known is quite accurate. Thank you.
In your research, I mean, you're talking about a lot of these domestic forces at play. Did you encounter many foreign influences that may have had a stake in the matter of the Reformation?
Yes, I did. So especially this Reformation in Sweden, we're going to see a lot of support from this, especially from the city-state of Lubeck. So whenever there's conflict in Scandinavia in this period, Lubeck has its hands all over it because they're lending money to everyone. They're just trying to make money off of everything and get as many economic concessions as possible. So Lubeck is a huge player in this. Gustav Vasa kind of has an evolving relationship with them, but they will become the leader of the city-state will later become a very die-hard Lutheran himself and really wants to spread the faith. Other foreign powers, I mean, we're always going to see a threat from Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. He's always threatening to intervene and bring back the old king of the Kalmar Union. Never really happens. I mean, that's a whole nother story. But those are probably our big two foreign powers that are trying to get involved. Yeah.
What surprised you the most doing this research? Was there a moment or an episode that just really sticks out that you weren't expecting?
It's a good question. If I were to say one thing that surprised me is, yeah, that's a good question. I would say I didn't know a lot about the Catholic response to a lot of the Reformation going on, especially in Scandinavia. We kind of hear of just like this big move. Oh, we go from Catholic to Lutheran. We don't really hear much about, well, what's this fight back looking like in the process? So I'd say hearing about Bishop Brosk and reading about what he was doing, trying to combat the Reformation, was all news to me. Yeah.
What sources did you use? What was that the primary source that you are using for your research?
So
you use several sources.
yeah, I didn't put my sources in here. They're in my paper. But yeah, I took a look at some of the Swedish documents from Westeros, even though the language is really different. It's really changed over time, which I was really surprised by. So I was looking at a lot of documents from these and seeing like, what is the purpose of this? What are we actually changing here? So that's for primary documents. I've really been looking at these like these coming together and these documents from here, and then I've also been looking at church ordinances. So both Denmark and Sweden are eventually going to develop their Lutheran church ordinances, and part of my project is comparing those. So looking at those for primary sources. And then other sources, there are some really good books on the subject. There's a professor by the name of James Larson, I think out from California, who wrote pretty big books spanning the whole subject of the Reformation in Scandinavia. And then I think the Swedish king ordered a history of the Reformation that's from the 19th century. So there may be a little bias in that one, but still a useful work to rely on. Yeah. Ursula?
I'm curious about when you talked about the Catholic response and the printing press that Gustav Vasa ended up shutting down with Bishop Brosk. What language or languages were the Catholic presses printing in at the time? And was it different when they were printing, for example, religious texts such as the Bible versus when they were printing responses, like theological responses to the Reformation and the 77
Mm-hmm.
Theses?
That's a good question. So, let me go to that page. So, in terms of languages for everything, so for when we're talking about scripture, the Catholic Church isn't opposed to printing it in Swedish. They just wanted to take more time with it, just because they're worried people are going to misinterpret things. So like they're open to the idea of printing in Swedish later. So like when we're looking at like the New Testament being printed, the Catholics actually had a say in this. They were talking with them, the king was, and it's like, well, can we wait on this to make sure all the translations are going to be right? The king more wanted to rush things out. In terms of printing these like pamphlets in literature to influence things, I think it was mostly in Latin, since it's aimed at a lot can be aimed at the higher classes, but there may have been some in Swedish. It's not something I really looked too much into yet. It's definitely something I'll look into now that you mention it, but.
Yeah, I'm curious about that. And I'm also curious about what the level of literacy would be among people who might be interested, particularly when you talk about all of the peasant uprisings against Gustav Vasa.
Yeah.
And the skin they had in the game, so to speak. You know, if would they even be an audience for written argumentation, or because I don't know what the level of literacy would be among the peasants at that time either. So that I'm just curious what languages would be used and printed, and who their audiences would be, I guess.
Yeah, that's a great question. We really don't know what the peasants thought about like certain, theological changes.
Yeah.
Like I think there are some things that like visible changes, like when Swedish soldiers come into the church,
Yeah.
take things out.
Yeah.
I think that's something that can really stir peasants up to arms.
Oh, sure.
So yeah, I can't say I really know on that side, but I'll definitely take a look at that. Thank you.
I'm curious to know if you find.
Yeah.
A couple,
Did many rural communities, the communities farther away from Stockholm, remain Catholic, and for how long?
Yeah, this is actually a place of ongoing research of like how long things are remaining. So a lot of these rural communities, they don't really quite get like exactly like, oh, we're Lutheran now, but like, what does that mean? They do not know all these fancy theological arguments. They don't know what's going on in Wittenberg. Like a lot of these, we can see a lot of Catholic things continue on for a lot longer. Like we're gonna see pilgrimages still remain really popular for the rest of the century. Shrines are gonna be really important. Incense is still gonna be very commonly used. Like how communion is performed is still gonna be done in the Catholic style. In rural communities for quite a lot longer. And so it's in Sweden, like in Denmark, we're gonna see like these superintendents and their like supporters go out to rural communities to make sure everything is actually being changed. We're not really gonna see the same thing in Sweden for quite a while, like this kind of enforcement of change in rural communities for quite a while. So definitely gonna live on for quite a while in this century, but we aren't really sure how long.
a couple of literary sources that might be interesting for you to read. August Strindberg, the playwright, wrote 2 plays that deal with this period. Gustav Vasa is one of them, and Master Olof is another one, written in the late 1890 or 95 or something like that.
Yeah, 18.
And I mean, it's his bias, his interpretation of history, but even so, you might get some interesting points from those 2 plays. Gustav Vasa and Master Olof.
Particularly since Strindberg was very much someone who sought at least to bring up the viewpoints of lower classes and working class people. He was more interested in that than in the opinions of the elites.
That sounds really interesting. I will have to take a look, because that does have to do with my research, especially I take a deep dive on like what different sections of society think about the Reformation. So that does sound really nice. Thank you.
The library has those two ways, and they're very well annotated.
Oh,
Yes.
excellent.
So there's plenty of material in addition to the plays themselves.
Excellent, thank you. Any more questions?
Do we know what happened to Bishop Brask?
So, I do not remember what happens exactly after exile. Unfortunately, in this time period, a lot of people will go into exile, and that's just where their story stops. So, it's a very common story, but I mean, if it was too bad of an ending, we probably would have heard about it. He was probably just fine somewhere. Maybe Rome, who knows? Yeah. I mean, it could be documented. I just haven't looked at it, so sorry, I don't know. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.